I am here very happy and with great pleasure to present you Jeff Booth, our first keynote of the conference. I'm really looking forward to his speech, so I'll try to be brief, but tell you, if in case you don't know him, tell you a few things about him. Jeff is a tremendously successful businessman and entrepreneur. He has led Build Direct, a company that is related to building in a new way through different moments in history, complicated, such as the dot-com bubble and the 2008 bubble, always with great success. He's a member of several boards of very respected companies in North America. He's been featured in media all over the world. And last, but definitely not least, and this is probably the biggest reason why he's here, he's the author of a book called The Price of Tomorrow, which, I mean, simply put, to me, is one of the most significant books of the 21st century. On that book, among other things, Jeff presents a very provocative thesis about the so-called D word, something that has been repugnant for many school of thoughts, central bankers, and public officials. The D word is, of course, deflation. So, without further delay, I leave the floor to Jeff, and let's welcome him with a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody. It's a huge honor to be here. So you set that up perfectly. This is going to be provocative, and system changes that we're going through. It is very likely that you measure a system from the system. So a lot of the things that I'm going to say are going to potentially feel very, very different from your mental model of what the world looks like today. So first, I just want to start by doing this. If I fold this piece of paper once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, I keep folding it on itself. If I fold it 50 times, how thick is a piece of paper? Inch, meter. That piece of paper would reach the sun. So, and I don't do that to say, okay, you don't get it. That the average answer, the 99.9% of the people that I ask this question to, and I've asked this question to tens of thousands of people all over the world in audiences like this, guess 2 inches, guess your inch. And then when they hear it later on that it reaches the sun, they go and Google that, and then they think they know exponential patterns because they know a parlor trick. And they tell their friends how they know exponential patterns. And if you didn't get that answer, and it's impossible to get that answer, nor I couldn't get that answer the first time that I saw it, it's impossible unless you're actually thinking exponentially. And we live in a world that's moving exponentially on Moore's law. You must ask yourself, what else might you miss? Because and it's the same reason than in what's happening in technology, doubling at the rate it's every 18 months to 2 years. It's a massive chaos and change is coming through society that we're not prepared for because we're not thinking in those terms. Some of the business people I create technology companies for a living. I know how to create systems to take advantage of that by predicting where technology is going on that trend. But most people, including economists, including the highest people in society today, don't think like that, nor why would they? Because they've never had to. Technology's never moved that fast. I'll give you, and if you think about that just in what I'm saying, and you go, why is there always a hype cycle in technology? The hype cycle is actually created from the same thing. In the early folds, when we see robotics, when we see AI, when we see 3D printing, in the early folds, some people tell us, wow, this is going to change the world. And it does that. It does nothing. and it keeps folding, it keeps doubling, and it keeps doubling. In the later folds, we underestimate that by a staggering degree, a staggering degree. And so if we're on fold 34 right now, and if you think about Moore's law in 34 doubles, what happens in 18 months? So when we're measuring backwards, looking back at our historical models, what happens going forwards? That's going to be a little bit of the talk today. So you can see this right before 1985, the Apple computer had 25,000 transistors. The one launched last week has 57 billion transistors. One launched last week is 1.5 times faster than one launched last year, and it'll use 60% less power. And so what happens here is our world is moving faster and faster and faster, way faster than we can predict. And we don't predict the future. We look backwards at historical patterns, and we predict the present forward. And in that prediction problem, we don't predict ourselves changing. We think everything else will change, but our minds won't change. We stay the same, everything else changes. So we predict our present forward and not saying this. And actually, that's what entrepreneurs do. They take advantage. That's what I do in business. You take advantage of that, what the world believes as a foundational belief, and you think, wait, with technology, I can create way better outcomes for people. And if those better outcomes are found by the market, more people will change their mind from what they believed here and do something different. And I look back at things like this, and I think when Walmart came into town in North America, everybody would talk about why don't people support Main Street? And the same people that would talk about, well, why don't you support Main Street, shopped at Walmart. And so you predict what everybody else should do, but you do something different as something gives you more value. And those prediction problems, but I do this not to point out specifically Krugman here, but by 2005 or so, it'll become clear the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than fax machines. But underestimating that Metcalfe's law produces some pretty big errors. Here's what he said in 2013, defending this quote. He said, I'm an economist. I rarely make predictions on technology, nor should I. Okay, think about that. That's like a doctor saying, I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon, I shouldn't understand how the heart works. Or like a captain of a ship saying I shouldn't understand weather because I'm a sailor. If the economy is more and more transitioning to a digital economy, and an economy is on the very nature of a digital transition, if you don't understand that digital transition, you're going to be left out in the cold. And what does that mean? And so and what does it mean specifically for economics? Kodak invented the digital camera. Kodak is no longer relevant because they defended a monopoly around distribution. And that distribution, and so now think about that digital camera, what you got, that digital camera, a 3D digital camera that is going to usher in 3D world on your phone, is a $5 bill of materials on the iPhone today. 15 years ago, that would have been, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it would have been $600. So you couldn't do that. But technology getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so what does it do for you? It gives you more for less. We have an abundance in photos. We have an abundance in editing software. It's all free. It's the very nature of that abundance creates deflation. It gives us more for less. And that's why we use it. And that's why we create those monopolies, because rational actors choose things that give them more value. What did it do to the music industry? The music industry was at its peak. It's about half of what it was at its peak as it transitions to a digital world. Now think of all the artists that were blocked by the existing monopolies that we could have never found. We listen to more music, more diversity of music today. We get more for less, and it costs less. And that very nature of that happening across our societies is deflationary. Look at your phone. Things turn into information. Think about your desk 20 years ago, calculator, all of the different things on your desk that are now an app on your phone. Things turn into information, and information trends towards its marginal cost of production. The marginal cost of production, with artificial intelligence moving at the rate it is, trends towards free. And so you have this force of good in the world that we all use, the technology that's actually, we use technology to free our time. Same reason I use technology in my businesses is to make more value, to deliver more value to society. And if I don't do that construct, my business fails. And so you have one path that's trying to do that, and another path that's fighting that. And so, I'll show you this video. This is 10 years ago, Boston Dynamics. Seven years ago. One year ago. This year. And again, in that, ask yourself if you saw the video 10 years ago, would you have predicted today? And you can see that prediction problem. And ask yourself if you also, if you see that, where will that be in 10 years from now? Because what you'll capture in your brain is that going forward, and you'll capture those machines going forward instead of them miniaturizing and AI moving everywhere and it looking totally different. That is the picture you'll capture. And you might see that picture with guns on it and everything else and who controls that picture. But you won't see what actually happens because the technology is still moving at that rate. So you have these, and this affects everything. You have these collision of two giant forces. Technology on one side, wanting to free our time. If you think about money just as a concept, it's an abstract concept for our time. And we use technology to give us more time. That's why we use it. We could dig holes with spoons. We don't because we save time with technology. And that technology is now transferred to a point, largely because of those folds, to a point that it doesn't look like it used to. It's moving so fast, and it changes everything. And you have central banking, and I could have put inflation here or central banking. I'm not trying to do this to push, to say it's any person's fault. That's really important. It's a mistake of unable to grasp what's happening with technology in a system that's reinforcing itself. And those systems cannot work together. They're polar opposite systems. So what would it look like if you tried to drive inflation in a massively deflationary world? And think about what inflation is. We don't even question it. We say an economy requires inflation. Has anybody asked themselves why? Is there a rule that says we can't live in a productive society without money losing its value every year? Because 2% inflation is really just a theft that transfers money to the wealthy from the poor. And so we don't question the 2% inflation, or is that okay? Or 5% inflation isn't okay? 20% is it? We don't question. We don't say the rate of theft is okay or not. So you have a fraud based into the monetary layer. And I understand why when I say the fraud, those are harsh words. But it's why? because you, me, everybody will always vote to get more than we can actually get. So we'll vote in people who tell us this little lie that we can pay for something that we can't. And so that system requires that, because we vote for that system, feeds back on itself and feeds back on itself and feeds back on itself, and it gets so large. And those two forces right now are getting further and further apart. So if you actually let deflation work in the natural economy, what would happen? A credit-based system collapses to the ground. Everything, every institution on top of it, bank failures, it would be horrific. But in the same breath, that's what has to happen at some point. So how do you deal with those things? So when I was writing my book, one of the things I thought, okay, if technology is moving this fast, there must be some artifact evidence that of being offset, that technology declining, right? Something must be pushing prices up and offsetting that. So this is the end of 2019, approximately $150 trillion of debt to run an $80 trillion global economy. But this was a smoking gun. $185 trillion of that debt came in the last 20 years. And so from the system, when you know one system's going one way, one system has to go the other, you could predict what has to happen with COVID. You could predict what has to happen with how much more debt has to go in to offset everything. And that debt, or that inflation, or to try to monetize that stealing from society to do it, what would that then move into? And the signposts are everywhere. That Amazon picture is from Mexico. In the slums, you have this Amazon warehouse. It's kind of stark. You have record inequality, because what is inflation? The other side of the coin of inflation is wage deflation. So you're telling an entire audience that we're going to pay you less so you have more jobs on an ever-increasing basis. So essentially you end up concentrating all wealth and control on very few hands as AI keeps moving and what that looks like. And you get you get the societal collapse all over the world. And that societal collapse is caused by, and those same people that are getting hurt most turn to the same governments who even if central banking was neutral, it can't stay neutral. It gets co-opted by governments because the people demand that it gets co-opted by governments, because most of the people are hurt by the same process, but they don't know why. They haven't put it together why they're hurt from that process. And so, and you get regulatory capture, and you get and it keeps on accelerating. And we've seen this throughout history on these changes. And a lot of people talk about kind of the misinformation today, and I think they potentially get it a little bit wrong. And every technology, by lowering the cost, that threshold, creates more brains kind of contributing to world knowledge. So if you think about the printing press, church had monopoly power over information. Printing press lowered the threshold for more people to contribute. Galileo, ostracized by the church. They took off his middle finger, jail, everything else. But those signals that put an incongruence with the teachings of the church that were the real signal lived on, and they were and the best signals that information, that really powerful information demands an answer. And so the signal cuts through the noise with clarity, and people, okay, now I need to know this, I need to know this, I need to know this, which takes away that same power over time. And you're seeing a similar thing. A lot of misinformation in the signal as well, tons of misinformation, as the internet has brought way more voices on, social media has brought way more voices, but the signal, one of the reasons probably my book became a bestseller, is because it's hard to argue something like this that demands an answer. and more people talking about it start to produce that signal. Now they can question, have I made a mistake in the thesis, everything else. The more people start to deepen, you change minds. And when you think about, and I'm really deep on AI, but if you think about our biological computer, on how we learn, it's a slow process. And it's an error correction process of practice. But we harden those, what ends up happening in our own brains, we harden those mental models. And because we can't investigate them down to the ground, like we used to, we harden it and we take shortcuts and we build on top of those mental models. I would argue today that the entire monetary system is one of those shortcuts that most people just take for granted and build on top of that, and they can't see this. It is literally blind to a lot of people until you bring it into view, talking through different language. And so what happens with that? You have one path that we know. We know. Most of the deflation is in front of us, not behind us. We have another path, we have the same path that we know that central bank, that currency cannot exist, that monetary policy can exist without that, and it has to keep printing, or you'll have a complete credit collapse and a depression that would make the Great Depression look on steroids. And so everything would collapse. I often ask, which snowflake causes the avalanche? What people are doing is looking around at the snowflakes, talking about the snowflakes, instead of the system and the fragility that's building into the system because of this talk, because of this. And so it enters a paradox. And that paradox is a really hard thing for our brains to solve. And here's the paradox. Accelerating digital technology growth requires a digitally native currency that allows for deflation. And I'm going to put a caveat here. It doesn't require it if you concentrate all power and control in a small group of people who determine what's good for everybody else. It doesn't require it. Somebody could just say, I'm going to, and that is the path that we're heading without what I wrote here. That is the path. That short-term nature to kick the can down the road is creating greater and greater instability all over the world. And a system built on credit can't allow that for fear of that cascading credit collapse. So how do you solve that paradox? And I mentioned this before, but again, most people think housing goes up forever. And they think housing goes up forever because they're measuring a system from a system that there was $185 trillion of stimulus to create housing going up forever in the last 20 years. They don't realize that the negative externality of that to somebody else that's rents are going up and higher and higher is a staggering miss, and you can't fix the system from that system. But we measure everything from that system, everything. And so it's hard to step out of the system to measure something from a different system. And I figured this conference would like this quote, but I think it's actually really important to how technology tends to emerge. It wasn't there before. We increment on our past learnings. And specifically there, I'm going, well, all we can do is some sly roundabout way to introduce something they can't stop. And by they, don't think, nobody's trying to hurt you. It's just how, if you were a central banker today, what would you do? Because the system would collapse if you raised interest rates, the system would collapse if you don't keep on, and so they're stuck. And that's what, and I'm not sure how many in this room, I actually should by a show of hands, how many people hold Bitcoin? Not bad, not bad. What I would recommend highly for anybody who doesn't, get off zero, like today. It is, we'll talk a little bit about it. But what is it? It's an open decentralized network that as people are voting for a new money, essentially by stopping creative destruction at the economy level, creative destruction moved to the monetary level. That's what's happening. And so you have a network that's expanding really fast, that's lowering threshold costs, that's open for anybody, and no one can stop it. It's impossible to stop. And I'm sure there'll be some questions there, but and what I like about it, I don't need wealth of Bitcoin. Bitcoin could go to zero for me. That's actually not why I'm in it. But if you think about this as a transition mechanism to get to the other side, we know we're in a system that can't work. And I like to think of business examples in a company, and most times in a company, what a company does is drive them off the cliff by protecting the status quo. And if you looked at what central bankers today and all of this entire globe, it's driving them off of a cliff by protecting the status quo. And what the greatest companies do is they put a research lab outside of the main company that does something different. Think iPhone, blocked from the rest of the company. Nobody even knew it was there because it had to emerge without this thinking to be the new company. And you need, and what I'd call that is, you need to think of this as a network transfer. People need to move to a system, because if you measured your world in Bitcoin, you would see what I'm talking about. You'll see deflation forever. So people think about it as pricing going up, prices of Bitcoin going up, but the more important thing is everything is coming down in relation to Bitcoin. It's the most true sense of what the free market is looking like. Highly volatile. It's still early, very early in that cycle. Remember how volatile Amazon was early in the cycle? And Bitcoin right now is growing at the same rate as the internet. But it's growing at the same rate of the internet, and if you take an overlay of when, 1998. Google wasn't invented until 2000. Facebook not till 2008. Most of the value came on the second layer of Bitcoin, of the internet, and that's a similar thing that's happening here. But more importantly, it allows people to move from one system to another. Now I know that's really hard to grasp today with Bitcoin, and again, but that's hard to grasp because you're projecting present Bitcoin forward, just like Paul Krugman in 1998 predicted present internet forward. But a network effect that gets stronger and stronger as technology moves to that and gets better and better looks very different on the other side. And that's what that looks like. And it's emergent. So it actually does its job by redistributing power to everyone else. And think about what technology does at its core. Technology, in any company, in any business, you have a monopoly. That technology changes the rules to allow more people into the system. It reduces friction cost. And so when you think about that in Bitcoin specifically, that's actually what it's doing. And as people are joining that system, it's actually making it stronger and stronger and stronger. And it's so the number of people that will hold or defend or building towards it is staggering today, and getting some of the smartest minds around building this network. And so again, that prediction problem, people are predicting what it is today forward instead of saying what it will turn into. I'm going to end with this just before I open it up for questions. But ultimately, you have this dilemma. You have abundance and money, which equals scarcity everywhere else. And I'm specifically talking where we are moving with technology. Or scarcity in money, which drives abundance everywhere else. And with that, I will turn it over to some questions.
As we start, I want to start with the first one, Jeff. Two quick questions. They are not, firstly, why Bitcoin and not gold?
And could gold go up? Yes. could central banks kind of make it? So today you have a world where with more and more mistrust, largely caused by when you have misinformation and money, you have misinformation everywhere. And so people are trying to, and so countries, through game theory and everything else, have the same, how do I do trade with somebody I can't trust, everything else, and that's growing at an exponential rate because of the exponential rate of money printing. And so could there be an environment where a bunch of central banks get together and say, okay, we're going back to the gold standard? I see it as highly unlikely, but the bigger reason there is, this is the first time in history of this innovation in Bitcoin that you could actually remove that problem, because gold served for a lot of time as that stable currency, or holding systems in check. But what always happened with gold? Because it had to be centralized, it would always be captured and then repriced throughout time. And so it requires somebody else deciding. And that decision, and again, don't take yourself out of that decision process, because I think a lot of you would make the same decisions. We think we want everybody else to do one thing while we do another. And so we would elect the same people, and that decision, it creates this cascade of a credit-based system on top of it, and that credit-based system on top of it must keep expanding. And while you see these events through history unfold is because of the same thing. And Bitcoin is the only thing I've seen. I've looked everything. You can imagine if I'm talking here, I've really done this. It's the only thing I've seen that actually has a chance to forever remove humans from the loop in a monetary system. And I think that's actually a requirement, because humans are not, by history, are not great people to put in control of something as important as money, our time.
We have just to get in order 3 questions there and 2 there, so please, go ahead.
Dear Mr. Root, I would like to ask you to explore a little bit your thoughts regarding deflation. You mentioned that credit will not work, but as an everyday person, I think technology and companies will be more efficient, my salary will be worth more. What is the bad thing in deflation?
There's way less jobs. It actually happens by removing jobs. That's why we use technology. And the rate of job destruction is, and if you allow that to fall at the natural rate. So there's this thing in our brains that can't see the abundance because we've always lived in a different system. The most valuable thing to everybody sitting in this room, the most valuable in everybody's life right now is the air you're breathing. More important than water, more important than anything else. What is the oxygen you're breathing, the air you're breathing? So if it's the most valuable, why isn't it the highest price? And there we see the abundance creates free. And we are in an escalating path to create free, because there's no way you could build a company unless you're selling air underwater or in space to be able to sell air, where it's scarce. And so we have one system wanting to create abundance everywhere and one system trying to stop it. And the abundance comes from the job declines that actually save you the time. You don't need all the jobs to keep up with the rate of pricing, because the technology does the job. But you're driving people, essentially you're creating modern day slavery by driving people to have to work harder and harder and harder on an escalating wheel to keep up to prices that you're creating them to go up. That's the dilemma.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you won't mind me observing that gold has been reinserted into the payment system in a decentralized way through an app called GlintPay, which people can find online. I should say I'm a small investor in it. But my question for you is, what do you make of central bank digital currencies, particularly in the context of the great struggle that you forecast ahead?
So I wrote a Medium piece it's called The Greatest Game, and I would encourage you to look it up because it talks about that. Central bank digital currencies is actually a natural extension of what has to happen in a system that must keep going. It's essentially saying that we can't do this from an independent central bank anymore. we have to drive it into government, which is going to be driven by people, and we have to control everything. We remove the banks from that process, and we do direct transfers. And you could look at that as central bank digital currencies as surveillance disguised as money. But that is where the world is going without Bitcoin. That is where the world is going. It's actually, that's why it's that important. It's critically important. And why will people do it? Because they'll get more for it. That's why this is. So our incentive structure kind of feeds back on itself. Why are people voting for socialism all over the world when it's a failed experiment all over the world? Because if you were them and you couldn't pay your bills and everything's going up, you're looking to the system to help you because you don't know.
We have a question there by the gentleman with the beard.
So thank you very much. I mean, politicians and economists are already for centuries, or let's say 150 years, obsessed with economic growth. But the way we measure currently economic growth with GDP is through the price of the output. So whenever there is a new good or new services that provides for needs in a cheaper way, it is not captured in our measure of output and our measure of economic growth. Have you thought about how can we measure economic growth in such with deflationary technology, or shall we give up on measuring it?
So that's actually the entire point. The entire point is when we talk about productivity growth, can we actually look at our phones and say we haven't had productivity growth? Can you actually look at your life and everything else, look at the Zoom, what you're able to do all over the world, and say we haven't had productivity growth? We haven't had productivity growth because we're measuring it in a system that productivity growth is deflation. Because it doesn't require, things turn into information, information trends to free. That productivity growth is deflation. And we're capturing it and concentrating power as a result. So and when I said we measure a system by the system, and when a measure becomes a metric, it ceases to be a good measure. So we measure inflation, we measure GDP and everything else, and it ceases to be a good, it's not an output derived, we're creating it artificially.
Anthony.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you very much. So, as you mentioned, people are voting socialism everywhere, even though it's a failed system. I think the pandemic has proven that people are willing to tolerate all sorts of controls in their life. In India, building codes stop people from upgrading from shanty towns. So I'm wondering if the thrust of your presentation is to say that ideas are not, like changing people's minds and ideas is not what's going to reform our society, but technology, as long as people allow that to do. So what is the relationship? What is the relationship between the two?
And thanks for the question. I think that's actually, we don't realize how much we will ourselves change. So today we're all sitting in this system, measuring a system, making the system stronger. In fact, even Austrian economics has been marginalized because the system's getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and people are, so it's marginalized all over the place. And it was built during a time of upheaval caused by similar transition, and people looking through to see how people act, actions and everything else, but is being marginalized through this. And saying, no, it should be Austrian economics on a system change, it's just going to marginalize it further. What ends up happening is you need a new, that's actually what Bitcoin is. So if you kind of said, it's a new technology that drastically opens the doors, why people in El Salvador, Nigeria, all over the world are flocking, why it's growing so fast, is because people are entering it. And here's a better way to look at it. Who were the first people on Amazon, or the first people to build to Google? I can tell you as a business, I was one of the first companies to build to Google. Why? Because I was blocked by the existing high-cost infrastructure of TV, radio, and Google gave it to me for free. So I built there. And it created a new monopoly because it empowered all those left behind. Who are the first people on Amazon's shelves? Not the people on Walmart. So technology displaces the incumbents by opening up, by reducing the power, by reducing costs so much for people most blocked by the system. So is it any surprise that El Salvador would advocate for that system. Is it any surprise that all over the world you have this growing? We don't see it because we live in a privileged society that hasn't had hyperinflation yet. We haven't seen all these things. It's coming, but we live in a bubble. In our privilege, we don't understand the negative externalities of that as a cost somewhere else. And that privilege kind of pushes us not to see it, or might just not see it. But what ends up happening is in a different system, we change. We all change. Just like if I had asked that question about this phone 15 years ago, people would have said, no, it needs more buttons. Right? And they wouldn't have seen it didn't just become a phone, it became everything. Your AI assistant, it became everything. Because we don't again, we predict forward our past. We don't predict on the future. And that's, so you need this system change that is allowing you to do that. It can't ultimately what I'm trying to get at, we could yell at the clouds all day long in the existing system. It can't change itself. It's impossible.
Okay, please. We have three probably final questions. Let's try to make it quick so we can fit them all. Please, go ahead.
Sure, great presentation. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering what you think of the future of Bitcoin as a usable currency, as opposed to a store of value, for example. Because as far as I understand it, it's not, the processing power is not powerful enough to be able to match, for example, the current banking system. So what do you think of that, and are there any alternatives?
So proof of work and the trade-off to be able to create something decentralized to the world and security so that it couldn't be taken is proof of work, which is also slow transaction fees or slow transaction speeds, 10 minutes on that. That is a function of the system, and it's the best way to keep that decentralized. The innovation comes on the second layer. So Lightning Network right now, what El Salvador implemented is a payment rails is way faster than Visa network, everything else, and it reinforces to the primary layer every 10 minutes. So you have so what you have is it doesn't have to be in the primary layer because otherwise you're trading security for speed. So you keep security in the primary layer and you build a secondary layer. And that innovation, and just starting now, if you see the rate of growth of the Lightning Network payment mechanism around the world, you would be blown away. It's a hockey stick growth. So you have two network effects. One is a store of value, one is a payment mechanism that are reinforcing each other on this. Most of what is to come is to come. It's but I see that emergent. I think right now it'd be hard to stop.
We have two questions here. It's in the front. Professor Turk first. And then you. No. First, Professor.
Thank you for a most interesting talk. How big a problem is it that it seems that a lot of the Bitcoin is owned by a very small number of people?
So I love that you asked that question. It's actually more and more spread out all the time. But actually think about a system dynamic. So a system dynamic where wealth doesn't equal power. Our existing system, wealth equals power. Wealth in a Bitcoin, if you try to control, or wealth doesn't equal control. If you try to control through your wealth, what that means is distributing your Bitcoin to other people. It's a system change that we can't even fathom because it's such a different system from what it looks like today. So by the very nature of a system moving to a free market system like this, it changes that dynamic. It's the only way for the abundance of technology moving at this rate to be broadly transferred to society. It's the only way without capture of... I kind of think of it this way. Who is the person that you want control of all other people with artificial intelligence and robotics? And who would stand up to that force once it consolidates? That's our choice. One of those two.
Just one question. Currently, we are living in a hybrid monetary system. It's partly serving the economy, but partly also serving the interest of the state and state elites. And part of the debt is helping surviving states. How to ensure that Bitcoin wouldn't be used the state also to serving its own interest and creating for debt, or ban it like China does, or trying to do.
So again,
I think
China's banned it now 5 times. And look at what it proves, by the way, and you have a different ideologue. You have an ideologue that says centralized control over everybody else, and through force or free market. And those are the ends of the spectrum where people make choices and everything else market's free. Those ideologues are competing right now. And so I said a long time ago, China has to ban Bitcoin because it defunds the state. It defunds the entire ideologue. But it doesn't matter because it also incentivizes. You know what just happened by them shutting down all the Bitcoin? You know what they created for the US and countries that are now, they created, it just distributed around the world, and they gave up an economic advantage, a staggering economic advantage on a new medium. It's like turning off the internet.
We have one final question, and then remember we're going to lunch, and you can, harass Jeff during 1 hour. So please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Is the microphone on? Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk, and it's certainly a very convincing argument that you present, but I've got some doubts about the health of the industry, to be honest. So I've looked at some reports of some Bitcoin miners, of the publicly listed ones, and I wasn't able to find one that makes money on mining. They all make money on speculation. And then you've got, there's joke coins, you've got Shiba Inu, you've got a Dogecoin, and they perform like Bitcoin. Don't you think that's a worrying sign? Thank you.
No, so let me handle the first one first. The incentive structure for Bitcoin mining, designed into reducing the payment out of it, is designed to actually keep really small margins. And so in certain hype cycle or in certain cycles, they can make more. But what happens is more people make money on it, more miners race in and arbitrage that and brings it back down. So it's just a natural market cycle that is actually built into the code, built into the incentive structure. Everything else, every other altcoin, I kind of think about it this way. Of course, if Bitcoin went from $0 to $65,000, and somebody said, "Oh, I'm going to create Dogecoin, and I'm going to have, and I can create this better one," then they can create a whole bunch of money for themselves. It's the opposite of decentralization. It's all of those other things are an attempt to actually create centralization, or to not an attempt, but they would. I asked if I simply said, if all my Ethereum was on Amazon servers. Majority of it is, and people with guns came into Amazon and said, "Turn off Ethereum," would people turn it off? And there you have your answer, whether it's decentralized or decentralized. And so, can people make money speculating in all these other things? But typically what ends up happening in technology is you have to have a 10x advantage to be able to beat the incumbent. And why? Because people close the gap. The incumbent tries to block you. Bitcoin has that 10x advantage, and it's emerging. And now you have a network effect that's growing, and getting stronger and stronger and stronger. I ask myself, what could, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I can't think of anything. I certainly haven't seen anything that gives me a 10x on Bitcoin.
Jeff, thank you very much. We'll invite you all to have lunch, and thank you.
Thank you.